Before we embark on creating this unique story, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new plots, mysteries, or custom adventures. Shall we begin? The millionaire opened the door and couldn't believe what he saw. That house, valued at figures that needed no advertising, stood isolated on the hillside of Carmel by the sea, like a silent monument to Jonathan Hale's success. Large windows facing the Pacific, exposed concrete mixed with dark wood, invisible security operating in the background. Everything there existed to keep the world away, and yet, on that grey morning, the world had found a way to knock on its door. Jonathan was not a man given to surprises. At 48, he had built a career based on predictability, calculated investments, studied risks, people chosen like pieces on a chessboard. Every detail of his routine was precisely controlled. He woke up at 5:30, ran 7 kilometers, drank coffee without sugar, and initiated calls to New York before the sun even touched the California horizon. Nothing escaped his control. Nothing. Until that moment. The intercom had only rung once. Short, direct, unexpected. Jonathan wasn't expecting visitors. His employees wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours. No meetings were scheduled. No supplier would dare show up unannounced. Still, something about that unique touch made him get up from his office before he even finished reading the financial report he held in his hands. He walked to the door with firm steps, the discreet sound of the sensors recognizing his presence. The lock opened with an almost ceremonial click, and then the world that Jonathan thought he had abandoned was right there. On the other side of the door, a woman stood motionless. She didn't ask permission. She didn't smile. She didn't seem embarrassed. She wore a coat that was too simple for that neighborhood and held a worn bag, pressed against her body as if it were the only thing that still belonged to her. Her brown hair, carelessly tied back, had unruly strands escaping, and her face bore marks that Jonathan recognized even before he allowed himself to think about it. She was older, thinner, but she was unmistakable. Emily Carter. The name flashed through his mind like a sharp blow. Jonathan didn't recoil, didn't close the door, didn't make any gesture that would reveal the immediate impact. His body remained still, trained by decades of negotiations, where showing surprise was a sign of weakness. But something changed in the air. Emily held his gaze with disconcerting firmness. There was no pleading there, no explicit anger. Just a silent, heavy expectation, as if this encounter had been rehearsed for years, not through words, but through absences. Jonathan noticed the detail that disturbed him the most. She didn't seem surprised to see him. It was as if she knew exactly where he would be, as if she had followed an invisible map that he believed he had erased long ago. The conflict didn't need to be announced. It settled in that narrow space between the open door and the past that Jonathan had buried under layers of money, contracts, and silence. Emily was part of a life he had chosen to abandon. Before the companies, before the magazine covers, before the Hale name became synonymous with success in the financial market. She had known the Jonathan who shared small apartments, who made mistakes, who promised things he wasn't sure he could deliver. She had known the man before the emotional armor, before the fortune served as a shield. And now she was there, facing the final version of him, the one that left no trace. The wind from the sea carried a salty scent, mingling with the awkward silence. Jonathan noticed her hands trembling slightly, though her posture remained firm. This wasn't a casual reunion. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't curiosity. It was necessary. He realized then that this visit carried something deeper than unspoken words. There was an urgency in that gesture of crossing invisible continents to knock on the door of someone who had deliberately disappeared from his life. Jonathan stepped aside, making room. The gesture wasn't an invitation, but it wasn't a refusal either. It was a minimal, calculated, almost automatic concession. Yet, in doing so, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The unsettling sensation that a simple decision could destabilize entire structures. Emily entered without saying thank you. The door closed behind her with a sound too soft for the weight of what had just happened. Jonathan knew, even without questions or explanations, that this visit wasn't about the past. It was about something that had caught up with him in the present. Something he hadn't foreseen. Something that couldn't be bought, negotiated, or ignored. And, for the first time in decades, Jonathan Hale wasn't sure if he was prepared to deal with the consequences. The house seemed even larger on the inside, not because of the space itself, but because of the absence of life. Each object occupied an exact place, calculated to create a visual impact without revealing intimacy. Light leather sofas that had never been used. Modern works of art chosen by consultants, not based on personal taste. The environment perfectly reflected who Jonathan Hale had become, someone who projected control but avoided commitment. Emily walked a few steps and stopped near the glass wall overlooking the ocean. She observed the view as one recognizes something beautiful, but too distant to touch. Jonathan closed the door and remained still for a few seconds, assessing that presence as he assessed companies on the verge of bankruptcy. Trying to understand the risks, impacts, and consequences. He was the first to move. He indicated the room with a short, wordless gesture. Emily sat down, resting her bag at her feet, as if afraid of losing it if she strayed too far. Jonathan didn't sit down. He preferred to remain standing, arms loose at his sides, posture firm, a strategic position even within his own home. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't empty. It carried years of unexplained choices. Jonathan observed Emily more closely. The subtle lines around her eyes betrayed a life less indulgent than his own. Her simple clothes were not carelessness. They were necessity. Yet there was dignity in every gesture. Emily was not there to ask permission or to beg for something he could easily deny. She had always been like that. Years earlier, when Jonathan was still trying to settle in San Jose, Emily worked 2 jobs while finishing community college. She was the one who balanced the bills, who made feasible plans when he spoke of grand futures. When Jonathan received his first big opportunity in New York, it wasn't a lack of love that separated them, but his conviction that attachments were obstacles. He left, promising to return. He never came back. Emily, for her part, had rebuilt her life far from the world Jonathan had come to inhabit. She moved to Fresno, then to Sacramento. She worked in public schools, faced budget cuts, overcrowded classrooms, and long hours. She created a routine based on resilience, not exponential growth. While Jonathan learned to multiply figures, Emily learned to support people. Now those 2 trajectories collided within a minimalist room, surrounded by the distant sound of the waves. Jonathan finally sat down, but chose an armchair opposite her, creating a deliberate space between them. The conflict didn't need words to manifest itself. It was present in the way Jonathan avoided looking directly at her hands, and in the way Emily seemed to measure every detail of the environment, as if searching for something to explain the abandonment. The California that surrounded them was not the same for both of them. For Jonathan, it was conquered territory, contracts in Palo Alto, lunches in San Francisco, quiet influence behind the scenes in the financial world. For Emily, the state had always represented displacement, high costs, broken promises. That difference shaped not only their stories, but also their expectations. Jonathan broke the silence by pouring water. No formal offer, just the gesture. Emily accepted the glass, but didn't drink immediately. Her eyes were now fixed on him. There was something Jonathan couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't a direct accusation. It wasn't longing. It was a contained tension, as if Emily were there, because there was no one else to turn to, and at the same time, because he was the last person she wanted to seek out. He realized then that this visit would require more than passive listening. It would require confronting decisions he had always treated as necessary, inevitable. For the first time, his fortune offered no clear escape route. Outside, the fog began to rise from the sea, slowly swallowing the horizon. The house, once imposing, seemed too isolated. Jonathan felt the weight of something that had not yet been said, but which already pressed down on every inch of that space. The story he thought was over was only beginning to unfold. Emily was the first to get up, not out of impatience, but out of a need for movement. She walked to the open-plan kitchen, observing the spotless surfaces and appliances that looked like they had never been used. Jonathan followed her every step with his eyes, attentive to details, as if he were analyzing an unstable variable. She stopped before the marble island and rested her hands there for a moment, taking a deep breath. When she looked back at him, the silence was broken not by lengthy explanations, but by an observation too simple to ignore. "You achieved everything," he said, without emphasis, without irony. Jonathan didn't answer. He didn't need to. That phrase carried more than just recognition. It carried the distance between those who win and those who survive. Emily opened her bag and took out a crumpled envelope. She didn't hand it over immediately. She simply placed it on the counter between them, like someone positioning a crucial piece in a game the other doesn't understand. Jonathan stood up slowly, approaching. He didn't touch the envelope. The paper seemed too heavy for something so simple. Emily stepped back a little, as if giving him space to choose. Jonathan finally picked up the envelope. Inside were copies of medical documents, recent reports, dates underlined in pen. He didn't read everything. He only needed to recognize the name. Lucas Carter. The world didn't stop. There was no dizziness. There was no visible collapse. But something shifted internally, like a poorly designed structure giving way under pressure. Jonathan looked up, searching for Emily's gaze. She didn't look away. Lucas was 17 years old. His age was there, clear, undeniable. The dates cruelly coincided with the period when Jonathan had left California. He didn't need to do elaborate calculations. The math was too straightforward to allow for denial. The conflict intensified at that moment, not because of the revelation itself, but because of what it now demanded of him. Emily made no explicit requests. She didn't mention money, treatment, or support. She simply stated that Lucas was ill. His condition required specialized, expensive, and constant care. She had exhausted all resources, favors, and alternatives. That visit wasn't about reconciliation. It was about survival. Jonathan felt an immediate urge to resolve this, as he resolved everything, with transfers, calls, contracts. But there was an obstacle that no amount of money could easily remove: responsibility. He had built his identity on the idea of rational choices. Now he was confronted with a consequence that had never entered into his risk models. Emily watched every slightest reaction. The way he gripped the envelope, how he avoided direct questions, how he sought control up to that point. She wasn't there to accuse him, but she also wouldn't allow him to turn this into a cold transaction. Jonathan realized that any decision would affect not only Lucas, but also the carefully constructed image of himself. Getting involved meant exposing flaws. Refusing meant acknowledging, even silently, the extent of his absence. Tension increased as options dwindled. He walked to the window, gazing at the sea without truly seeing it. Outside, the fog had thickened. The landscape, once open, was now limited, as if the world had decided to shrink his field of vision. Jonathan knew that this conflict wouldn't allow for temporary solutions. It wasn't something that could be delegated. For the first time, he needed to decide not as a businessman, but as someone who had left something essential unfinished. When he turned back to Emily, his face no longer displayed its usual confidence. There was something rougher, less polished about it. The envelope remained in his hand, and with it, a choice that would change everything. Jonathan insisted that Emily stay at the house that night. It wasn't an overtly kind gesture, but a practical decision. There were doctors to contact, documents to verify, flights to rearrange. Emily agreed without argument, aware that any delay could cost too much time. Still, her presence made the house uncomfortable, almost hostile. While Jonathan made discreet calls at the office, Emily walked through the house like someone visiting a borrowed space. Each hallway reinforced the distance between the life he had chosen and the one she had been forced to build. The silent subplot there wasn't about resentment, but about belonging, or the lack thereof. Jonathan activated contacts at private hospitals in San Francisco and Los Angeles. He quickly discovered that Lucas's condition required a specific specialist, a pediatric oncologist, known for accepting only extremely complex cases. The doctor was involved in a project funded by a foundation that, ironically, received donations from Jonathan's own company. The coincidence brought immediate discomfort. He realized he had tried to buy redemption in installments, without ever looking directly at what he had avoided. Another layer was revealed when Emily mentioned that Lucas didn't know his father's identity. For the boy, Jonathan was just an absent name, never mentioned, never explained. This hadn't been an impulsive decision. Emily had chosen silence to protect her son from expectations that might never be fulfilled. Jonathan felt the weight of that choice. He hadn't just been absent, he had been deliberately erased. The time pressure intensified when tests indicated the need to begin treatment within a few weeks. There was no room for hesitation. Jonathan realized that simply financing the process wouldn't be enough. There were legal decisions, authorizations, travel arrangements. The logistics were becoming as complex as any business merger, with the stark difference that the failure here wasn't financial. An unexpected subplot emerged when Jonathan's legal advisor warned of potential risks of exposure. Any direct involvement could generate public questioning, speculation, and impacts on the market value of his companies. The advice wasn't about avoiding helping, but about doing so discreetly. Jonathan then realized the secondary conflict that was forming, protecting his image or facing the public consequences of a belated revelation. Emily, for her part, didn't get involved in those calculations. She was focused on Lucas. Every call Jonathan made, every decision he postponed, increased the distance between them. She demanded nothing more than the essentials, but her attitude made it clear that she wouldn't accept solutions that would turn her son into a problem to be hidden. Time marched on relentlessly. Flights were booked, appointments scheduled. The house, once a haven of absolute control, became a focal point for choices that Jonathan could no longer delegate. All the subplots, public image, medical logistics, paternal identity, converged on the same point. Jonathan would have to decide not only what he would do, but who he was willing to be from that moment on. The call came in the early hours of the morning, when the house was immersed in a silence too dense to be peaceful. Jonathan answered before the second ring, recognizing the number from the San Francisco hospital. It wasn't the specialist he was waiting for, but the medical coordinator responsible for triage. The news wasn't dramatized, it was objective, almost technical. Lucas's tests indicated a specific, rare genetic mutation that made conventional treatment ineffective. There was an experimental alternative underway, conducted by a team linked to a research center in Colorado. The problem wasn't just the cost or the distance, but the selection criteria. Only patients with a proven genetic link could be included in that protocol. Jonathan felt the impact even before he understood all the implications. This wasn't just a medical obstacle, it was a concrete demand for recognition. The conversation ended without guarantees. The deadline for confirmation was too short for prolonged negotiations. Jonathan remained motionless for a few seconds, the phone still in his hand, absorbing what that condition meant. There was no room for intermediate solutions. Either he formally acknowledged paternity with all that this implied, or Lucas would be left out of the only viable alternative at that moment. Emily listened to the news without interrupting. When Jonathan finished explaining, she didn't react with surprise. He simply nodded slowly, as if this were confirmation of something she always knew would happen. The turning point wasn't just the hospital's demand, but what it forced Jonathan to confront. Acknowledging Lucas meant exposing a part of his history that he had carefully erased. It meant facing not only the public gaze, but the gaze of his own son, albeit from a distance. Jonathan tried to reason with lawyers, explore legal loopholes, and expedite alternative processes. Nothing worked. The protocol was rigid, time was relentless. The decision needed to be made in days, not weeks. Emily made it clear that she wouldn't pressure him verbally, but there was a non-negotiable limit. She wouldn't allow Lucas's name to be used merely as a key to access treatment without any real responsibility. If Jonathan took responsibility, he would have to do it completely. That morning, Jonathan realized that the central conflict had changed in nature. It was no longer about helping or not helping. It was about identity, about admitting that his path to success had also been built on a deliberate absence. The man who had always controlled narratives now had to choose whether he would allow truth to exist outside of his own terms. Nothing that came after would be reversible. The official confirmation of paternity occurred quietly, almost clinically. Lawyers, documents, signatures, no press conference, no public announcement. Yet the decision reverberated in ways Jonathan hadn't fully anticipated. The first impact was internal. For the first time in years, Jonathan perceived a clear fissure between the image he projected and the reality he now needed to uphold. Acknowledging Lucas wasn't just a medical requirement, it was a commitment that couldn't be ended with a contract. Emily reacted cautiously. There were no effusive thanks or displays of immediate relief. Trust, for her, wasn't restored by a single gesture. Still, the initial tension gave way to pragmatic cooperation. They began exchanging information more frequently, aligning logistical decisions, discussing treatment details, and adjusting travel routes. Lucas was informed gradually. Emily explained the situation without dramatizing it, keeping the focus on the treatment. The existence of a distant biological father was presented as a fact, not a promise. Jonathan participated from a distance, respecting the pace set by Emily, even while feeling the weight of each indirect message. The external reaction came faster than expected. Despite efforts to keep everything discreet, information leaked. A business journalist published a brief note hinting that Jonathan Hale was facing a delicate personal issue. The market reacted with slight instability. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to alert the board of directors. Jonathan was confronted with the inevitable consequence of his decision. There was no longer an absolute separation between the public and private man. Every step now carried amplified repercussions. At the hospital, Lucas's acceptance into the experimental protocol brought an immediate change in the pace of events. New tests, new teams, new deadlines. Hope, once fragile, became concrete, but accompanied by unknown risks. Jonathan visited Lucas for the first time in a neutral setting, without formal introductions. He didn't introduce himself as a father. He made no promises. He simply was present. He observed the boy with silent attention, recognizing traits that couldn't be attributed to chance. That presence, though discreet, altered something essential in the dynamic between them. The consequences were piling up. Jonathan realized that each action generated new responsibilities, new expectations. There was no going back to the previous state. The tipping point had become a clear, dividing line. History was now moving forward under new rules. Jonathan's routine began to transform in an almost imperceptible yet constant way. He started to reorganize his commitments, shorten meetings, and delegate decisions that he had previously obsessively centralized. It wasn't sudden altruism, but forced adaptation. Even so, each choice distanced him from the man who believed that presence could be replaced by efficiency. In Colorado, the research center required frequent monitoring. Jonathan began traveling more regularly, not just to sign authorizations or speak with doctors, but simply to be there. He would sit in waiting rooms, observe procedures, and learn medical terms he never thought he would need to understand. He didn't ask excessive questions. He preferred to listen. Lucas, initially reserved, began to notice that consistency. Jonathan didn't try to occupy a space that hadn't been given to him. The relationship evolved without declarations, without attempts at exaggerated compensation. It was built on small gestures. A brief conversation about sports, choosing a movie to watch during an afternoon of exams, the shared silence when fatigue took over. Emily watched from a distance. Jonathan's growth wasn't manifested in belated apologies or justifications, but in his acceptance of limitations. He wasn't trying to rewrite the past. He dealt with the present as it was, imperfect, restricted, fragile. The biggest challenge came when the treatment presented unexpected side effects. There was a critical moment when the doctors needed to temporarily suspend the protocol. The frustration was immediate. Jonathan felt the urge to push, demand alternatives, use his influence. For the first time, he restrained himself. He trusted the process, accepted the vulnerability of the situation. This self-control marked a real change. He was beginning to understand that not everything could be accelerated, bought, or solved with willpower. In his professional life, Jonathan also began to reconsider his decisions. He turned down a lucrative deal that would have required him to spend weeks abroad. He didn't announce why. He simply adjusted his priorities. That choice cost money, but it brought something he hadn't measured in years: internal coherence. The journey of overcoming challenges wasn't dramatic or linear. There were relapses, moments of impatience and discomfort with his own emotional inexperience, but the growth was visible. Jonathan was learning to sustain his presence, not just results. And without realizing it, he began to transform, not into the man he should have been in the past, but into someone capable of taking on the present. The most recent tests indicated positive responses to the treatment, but were not conclusive. The experimental protocol was advancing to a crucial phase, with high risks and a minimal margin for error. The medical team was clear: the next few weeks would determine the outcome. Jonathan felt the weight of time more intensely than ever before. Every day counted. He completely reorganized his schedule, transferring strategic responsibilities to trusted executives. The subplot of his public image, previously a latent risk, began to resolve itself when Jonathan decided to no longer suppress rumors. He confirmed nothing, but he also denied nothing. This choice reduced external pressure, shifting the focus to what truly mattered. Emily, in turn, was dealing with years of accumulated physical and emotional exhaustion. Jonathan began to take on practical tasks: logistics, administrative support, secondary medical decisions, not as a replacement, but as constant support. The dynamic between them became functional, respectful, and free of disputes. Lucas showed clear signs of exhaustion, but also of resilience. The bond with Jonathan, not yet named, was strengthened by constancy. There was no explicit expectation of the future, only the acceptance of the shared present. The subplots converged. The Administrative Council accepted the temporary redistribution of power. The journalist who had hinted at the story lost interest in the face of the lack of public conflict. The legal issues were resolved. Only the essential core of the narrative remained: the outcome of the treatment. Tension mounted as the deadline approached. Jonathan realized that, regardless of the outcome, there would be no going back to the way things were before. He had crossed an irreversible internal boundary. On the eve of the final medical decision, Jonathan spent the night at the hospital. He didn't try to sleep. He simply remained there. The atmosphere, marked by artificial lights and controlled silence, contrasted sharply with the imposing house that now seemed too distant to matter. Everything was ready. The climax would not come as an abrupt surprise, but as an inevitable consequence of everything that had been built up to that point. The meeting took place in a room far too small for the importance of the decision. Jonathan, Emily, and two doctors sat around a simple table without screens or projected charts, just printed reports and restrained expressions. Lucas waited on another floor, accompanied by a nurse. The lead physician was blunt. The treatment had worked partially. The genetic mutation had responded erratically, creating a short and unique window for a final intervention. The procedure offered a real chance of remission, but it came with severe risks. The odds were not comfortable. There were no guarantees. Jonathan felt the urge to make the decision alone, as he always had. But he didn't. He looked at Emily. She held his gaze, steady, tired, lucid. The decision would be shared. That, in itself, was a definitive break with who Jonathan had been. When Lucas was called, he entered with slow but sure steps. He sat down before them, attentive. For the first time, he asked the question everyone had been avoiding: "Is he my father?" The silence that followed was short, but absolute. Jonathan answered before Emily needed to, not with a speech, not with belated explanations. Yes. There was no dramatization, just the truth, exposed without any embellishment. Lucas's reaction wasn't explosive. There was surprise, of course, but also something harder to define: alignment. The pieces that hadn't fit together were finally finding their place. He looked at Jonathan for a few seconds, assessing not the past, but what was before him now. The decision about the procedure was made next. Lucas agreed. Emily signed. Jonathan signed. None of them tried to soften the blow. The climax materialized hours later during the surgery. Jonathan waited outside, sitting motionless. For the first time in his life, he had no way to interfere. There were no phone calls to make. There were no shortcuts. Time stretched out cruelly. When the doctor finally left, his face revealed neither immediate victory nor defeat, just exhaustion. The procedure had been technically successful, but the final result would only be known in the following days. It wasn't the definitive conclusion Jonathan had hoped for. It was something more uncertain, more human. The turning point wasn't the instant cure, but the complete reversal of control. Jonathan understood then that his transformation wouldn't be validated by a positive result, but by his willingness to persevere even without guarantees. The central conflict was resolved not because everything had gone right, but because he had fully embraced what he had avoided all his life. The days following the surgery brought no immediate answers. The hospital settled into a slow, almost suspended rhythm, where each examination seemed to carry more weight than it should. Jonathan remained there, refusing appointments, postponing corporate decisions he had previously considered unavoidable. For the first time, his absence from the business world didn't cause him anxiety, only clarity. Emily alternated between moments of exhaustion and almost automatic vigilance. Jonathan began to occupy a space he had never claimed, but which he now sustained naturally, that of someone who stays. He fetched coffee, talked to doctors, accompanied Lucas on short walks down the hall when the side effects allowed. He made no promises. He was simply there. Lucas began to change subtly. Not just physically, but in his demeanor. Jonathan's presence, now acknowledged, didn't resolve old questions, but it created new possibilities. There was caution, yes, but also curiosity. Brief conversations arose without exaggerated expectations. The bond wasn't imposed, it was being built in the time available. When the first post-operative results arrived, they indicated neither absolute victory nor failure. The treatment had stabilized the condition. Complete remission was still uncertain, but the worst-case scenario had been avoided. Life went on, now under continuous observation. Jonathan received the news without euphoria. That moment didn't call for celebration, but for prolonged commitment. He understood, with unexpected clarity, that his journey didn't end there. That was merely the direct consequence of choices made late, but made nonetheless. In his professional life, Jonathan announced structural changes. He reduced his public exposure, redistributed power, and redefined priorities. The market reacted with initial bewilderment, then with acceptance. His image was neither destroyed nor glorified. It became more human, and this, curiously, strengthened his position. Emily observed these transformations without romanticizing them. There was no idealized reconciliation. There was respect. She recognized Jonathan's change not by his words, but by his consistency, by his lack of haste in fixing what couldn't be fixed immediately. When Lucas was provisionally discharged, the world seemed bigger again. Jonathan accompanied mother and son to the hospital exit. There were no speeches. Just a simple gesture. He placed his hand on Lucas's shoulder, awaiting permission. Lucas didn't move away. At that moment, Jonathan understood that the true impact of his actions lay not in medical reports or public decisions, but in the concrete possibility of remaining present, regardless of the future outcome. The past had not been erased, but it no longer ruled everything. Months later, the house in Carmel no longer felt like a place of isolation. Jonathan spent less time there, but when he was, the rigidity had given way to subtle signs of life. A backpack left near the sofa, a glass out of place. Lucas visited during the periods permitted by the treatment. There were still tests, uncertainties, and constant monitoring, but there was also routine, something simple, real. Jonathan watched the boy cross the room toward the balcony, the ocean once again visible beyond the mist. There were no guarantees about the future. But there was something that hadn't existed before, continuity, and that was enough. Stories like this aren't just about success, money, or late decisions. They're about real choices, made when time no longer offers comfort. Jonathan Hale wasn't transformed by a miracle, but by the willingness to stay when fleeing would have been easier. Now the question is up to you. What defines a person? Their achievements, or the responsibilities they choose to take on when there are no guarantees? Is it possible to rewrite the future without erasing the past? If this story provoked reflection, emotion, or identification, please share it and subscribe to the channel with someone who might also recognize themselves in it. Your interpretations, feelings, and conclusions are part of the cycle that keeps narratives like this alive. Thank you for following along this far.